I bought the house because of the tree. It wasn't the spacious living room or the charming wraparound porch, though those were nice too. No, it was the sprawling oak in the backyard, a giant that stretched its limbs high into the sky, casting a dignified shadow over everything beneath it. Local historians claimed it was over 150 years old, planted during the Civil War, a silent witness to generations of change. Neighbors would stop by to admire it, their children playing beneath its canopy, while the older folks reminisced about picnics and summer gatherings held in its shade. It was more than a tree. It was a piece of living history, something that tied the community to its roots, literally. Over time, it became my personal sanctuary. On stressful days, I'd sit beneath it with a book, feeling the world slow down as I watched the leaves dance in the wind. The HOA, of course, had a different perspective. From the moment I moved in, they saw the tree as an eyesore, or worse, a liability. I brushed off their initial complaints, thinking they'd come to appreciate its beauty in time. But that's not how HOAs work, as I would soon discover. A letter arrived in my mailbox just weeks after I moved in, politely asking me to consider trimming the oak to maintain uniform aesthetics. Uniform aesthetics? For a 150-year-old tree? It was laughable. That's when I met Karen. She didn't introduce herself as Karen. She introduced herself as the president of the HOA. She showed up at my door in a crisp blazer, holding a clipboard and wearing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Your tree is magnificent," she said, "but it doesn't comply with the neighborhood guidelines." She spoke as if she were handing down a royal decree. I politely declined her suggestion, explaining that the tree was protected under local ordinances and wasn't going anywhere. Her smile faltered for just a moment before she regained her composure. "Well," she said, "we'll have to see about that." At the time, I didn't think much of it. Karen was just another overly involved HOA president, drunk on power and obsessed with controlling her little fiefdom. But as I'd soon learn, she was far more than that. She was dangerous, and she had just declared war on my tree. Little did I know that oak would become the battleground for one of the most absurd and infuriating fights of my life. Karen wasn't one to let things go quietly. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing little signs of her distaste for my tree, and for me by extension. It started with more letters, each one escalating in tone. What began as helpful suggestions about trimming the branches quickly turned into stern warnings about potential hazards. Falling limbs, damage to neighboring properties, and even a hypothetical claim that the roots could interfere with the HOA's underground drainage systems. The letters always came with her signature, scrawled in looping penmanship, as though she took pride in every word. But Karen wasn't content to wage her war from the comfort of her HOA office. No, she liked to patrol the neighborhood personally. I'd often see her walking by my house, clipboard in hand, casting long, judgmental looks at the oak. Sometimes, she'd even linger in front of my driveway, pretending to jot down notes as if she were a city inspector instead of just a nosy neighbor with too much time on her hands. It didn't stop there. During one of the HOA meetings, which I only attended because Karen made it abundantly clear that all homeowners were strongly encouraged to show up, she brought up the tree in front of everyone. "We have a situation on Willow Drive," she announced, using my street as though she were trying to depersonalize it. "There's a tree that poses significant risks to our community. It's overgrown, unmaintained, and frankly, not in compliance with the HOA's landscaping guidelines." The room was quiet for a moment before someone asked, "Are you talking about the old oak?" Karen's smile was tight, her irritation barely concealed. "Yes, that one. It's an unnecessary liability, and we should consider taking steps to address it before it becomes a bigger problem." I felt my cheeks flush, but I kept my mouth shut. It was clear she wanted a reaction, and I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. To my relief, a few neighbors actually spoke up in defense of the tree, pointing out its historical significance and the fact that it had survived storms, droughts, and decades of change without issue. Karen nodded politely, but I could see the storm brewing behind her eyes. From that point on, her disdain became more blatant. She'd send landscapers to my house unannounced, claiming they were there to assess the situation. She filed a formal complaint with the city, alleging that the tree was a public safety hazard, though they quickly dismissed it after an inspection. And then there were the rumors. Neighbors started telling me that Karen had been making comments at block parties, calling the tree an accident waiting to happen, and accusing me of willfully neglecting my responsibilities as a homeowner. It wasn't just about the tree anymore. Karen had made it personal. I became the neighborhood pariah in her eyes, someone to be singled out and scrutinized. Every time I saw her, I felt the weight of her disdain, as though she were daring me to challenge her authority. But no matter what she did, I refused to back down. The tree had been here long before Karen, and I wasn't about to let her ego or her clipboard dictate its fate. What I didn't know was how far she was willing to go to get her way, or how devastating the fallout would be when her schemes finally came to light. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came in the form of a late-night knock on my door. My neighbor, Sarah, stood on the porch, her face drawn and anxious. She glanced over her shoulder before speaking in a hushed tone. "I heard Karen talking at the last HOA meeting," she said. "She's not going to let this go. She's been looking into loopholes, trying to find a way to force you to get rid of the tree." I thanked her and assured her I'd handle it, but her words lingered. If Karen was digging for loopholes, it meant she was escalating her efforts. And Sarah's nervousness wasn't unwarranted. Karen had a reputation for getting what she wanted, no matter the cost. The second warning came a few days later when I noticed a small group of HOA board members gathered at the edge of my property. Karen was there, pointing at the tree and speaking animatedly, while the others nodded and scribbled notes. I stepped outside and called out to them, asking if there was a problem. Karen's smile was as sharp as ever. "We're just conducting a routine assessment," she said. "Nothing to worry about." Routine? I hadn't been informed of any assessment. When I pressed her on it, she waved a piece of paper in my direction. "This is standard HOA procedure. We're reviewing potential hazards across the neighborhood. It's all for the good of the community." Something about the way she said potential hazards sent a chill down my spine. The third warning came in the form of a letter, this one thicker than the others. Inside was a detailed report claiming that the tree posed a significant risk to the neighborhood due to its size, age, and proximity to underground utilities. Karen had attached an itemized list of supposed violations, complete with photographs of the tree from every angle. The final page included a bolded statement. Failure to comply with HOA recommendations may result in legal action. I was furious. It was clear she was fabricating issues to justify her vendetta. But the real tipping point came when I discovered a small pile of ash at the base of the tree one morning. At first, I thought it might have been from kids playing with fireworks or someone carelessly tossing a cigarette. But as I examined it closer, I noticed something odd. The ash wasn't random. It was concentrated, almost as if someone had deliberately burned something near the tree. My stomach twisted. Was Karen behind this? It seemed far-fetched, but with everything she'd done so far, I couldn't put it past her. I decided to install a security camera overlooking the backyard, just in case. The final warning came on a particularly quiet night. As I sat on the porch, sipping tea and enjoying the cool breeze, I noticed a faint light flickering near the base of the tree. I stood and squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The light disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but the sight sent a jolt of unease through me. I didn't sleep well that night. Something told me Karen was planning something bigger, something that went beyond letters and threats. The tree wasn't just a thorn in her side. It had become a symbol of her inability to control me. And Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat. I didn't know it yet, but the fire had already been lit. I just hadn't seen the flames. The night was unsettlingly still, the kind of silence that feels alive, as if the world itself is holding its breath. I had gone to bed late, after a long day of emails back and forth with my lawyer. Karen's latest letter had made it clear she wasn't backing down, and my legal counsel suggested preparing for a drawn-out battle. I fell asleep clutching my phone, half expecting another email to come through. At 2:17 a.m., I woke to the acrid smell of smoke. My first thought was that someone was burning leaves nearby, an illegal but not uncommon occurrence. Then I heard the crackling, faint but unmistakable, like dry paper crumpling in a flame. My stomach sank as I bolted out of bed and rushed to the window. What I saw stopped me cold. My magnificent oak was on fire. The flames licked hungrily at its bark, climbing the trunk with terrifying speed. Orange and gold light danced in the darkness, casting long, flickering shadows across my yard. The branches glowed like molten metal, and the air was thick with the smell of burning wood. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen, as the enormity of what was happening sank in. Then I snapped into action. I grabbed my phone and called 911, my voice shaking as I told the operator about the fire. "It's my tree," I stammered. "It's huge. Please hurry." By the time I ran outside, neighbors were already gathering, drawn by the smoke and light. Someone had a garden hose, but it was pitifully ineffective against the roaring inferno. All I could do was stand there and watch as years of history and beauty were reduced to embers. The fire department arrived quickly, but the damage was done. They managed to contain the blaze before it could spread to my house or the surrounding yards, but the tree was gone. Its once majestic branches were now a charred skeleton, blackened and brittle against the pre-dawn sky. I felt a crushing sense of loss, as though a part of me had burned with it. As the firefighters packed up their equipment, one of them approached me, his expression serious. "We're going to file an arson report," he said. "The fire didn't start naturally. Someone used an accelerant." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Arson. Someone had done this on purpose. I glanced around at the crowd, my eyes scanning the faces of my neighbors. Most of them looked shocked, murmuring quietly to each other, or shaking their heads in disbelief. But Karen was nowhere to be seen. The police arrived shortly after, asking questions and taking statements. I told them everything I knew, including my suspicions about Karen. I even mentioned the ash I'd found near the tree weeks earlier and the strange flicker of light I'd seen that night. They took my report seriously, but without concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. The rest of the night passed in a blur of exhaustion and grief. By the time the sun rose, the tree was nothing more than a smoldering stump, its branches reduced to ash. I stood in the backyard, staring at the ruin, feeling a deep, seething anger building inside me. I didn't have proof yet, but in my heart, I knew Karen was behind this. She wanted the tree gone, and now it was. But what I didn't realize was that Karen wasn't finished. She was about to turn the situation into something even more absurd, and I was about to find myself in the fight of my life. In the light of day, the damage was even harder to stomach. The once magnificent oak, a testament to resilience and time, now lay in ruins. The charred remains stood like a tombstone in my backyard, a stark reminder of Karen's growing obsession. I spent hours cleaning up the debris, trying to make sense of the senseless, but every piece of ash felt heavier than the last. That afternoon, a knock at my door pulled me from my thoughts. It was Sarah again, her expression as serious as the night she'd warned me about Karen's scheming. This time, she wasn't alone. Behind her stood Mark, a neighbor who lived 2 houses down, holding a USB drive. "You need to see this," Sarah said. I led them into my living room, where Mark handed me the drive. "I've got a security camera that faces the street," he explained. "It's not the best angle, but I think it caught something." Heart pounding, I plugged the drive into my laptop and opened the footage. At first, it was just the usual, a quiet suburban street bathed in the glow of porch lights. Then, at 2:03 a.m., a shadow appeared near the edge of my property. The figure was partially obscured, but there was no mistaking the distinct gait. Clipboard or not, I'd recognize Karen anywhere. She moved quickly, glancing around before disappearing into my backyard. Minutes later, the faint glow of a flame flickered into view, growing brighter as the fire consumed the tree. By the time she reappeared, the fire had taken hold, and she hurried off down the street, clutching something in her hand. It was grainy and dark, but it was enough. "Do you think the police will use this?" Sarah asked, her voice a mix of hope and fear. "They'd better," I said, my anger simmering just below the surface. But before I could even consider my next move, my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from the HOA. I opened it, expecting another thinly veiled threat. Instead, it was a formal notice accusing me of negligence. According to the email, The fire had caused damage to HOA property, specifically the drainage system Karen had complained about in her earlier letters. They were holding me responsible for the costs of repair, which they estimated at $50,000. My blood ran cold. Not only had Karen destroyed my tree, but now she was using the fallout as a weapon against me. The audacity was staggering, even for her. The next few days were a blur of police reports, emails with my lawyer, and whispered conversations with neighbors who were slowly beginning to turn against Karen. Mark's footage was compelling, but it wasn't definitive. Without a clear shot of her face or the accelerant she'd used, it was circumstantial at best. Still, I wasn't about to give up. I pored over every detail of Karen's actions in the weeks leading up to the fire, trying to connect the dots. That's when I remembered the landscapers she'd sent unannounced to assess the tree. Their visit had struck me as strange at the time, but now it felt like a key piece of the puzzle. With my lawyer's help, I subpoenaed the landscaping company for their records. What they sent back was damning. Karen had specifically requested an evaluation of the tree's flammability risk and had even asked for recommendations on removing it quickly. The landscapers had refused, citing local ordinances protecting historical trees, but the paper trail was undeniable. It was the break I needed. I handed everything over to the police, who reopened their investigation with renewed vigor. Meanwhile, Karen seemed oblivious to the growing storm. She continued to parade around the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, as if nothing had happened. But I wasn't finished. If Karen thought she could burn my tree to the ground and leave me to deal with the ashes, she was sorely mistaken. The evidence was piling up, and with every passing day, I grew more determined to make her pay. What I didn't realize was that Karen had one more card to play, and it was the most outrageous move yet. Just when I thought things couldn't get more surreal, Karen escalated the conflict in a way only she could. A court summons arrived at my door one crisp morning, delivered in a plain envelope that belied the chaos it contained. Karen, acting in her capacity as president of the HOA, was suing me. The charges? Gross negligence for failing to maintain the oak tree, leading to the fire that she claimed caused damage to the HOA's drainage system and devalued nearby properties. The amount? A staggering $100,000 in damages. I sat on my porch, staring at the papers, my anger boiling over into disbelief. She had destroyed my tree, weaponized the HOA against me, and now had the audacity to drag me to court as if I were the villain in this saga. I imagined her sitting at her desk, penning the lawsuit with a self-satisfied grin, utterly convinced of her righteousness. At first, I thought it was a scare tactic, a last-ditch effort to get me to back down. But as I read through the paperwork, it became clear Karen wasn't bluffing. She'd hired a lawyer, a real one, not just some HOA lackey, and she had pieced together a narrative so twisted it almost sounded plausible. She claimed my neglect had created a fire hazard, and that my refusal to address the obvious risks had endangered the entire community. My lawyer, David, was calm but firm when I called him to discuss the situation. "This is a power play," he said. "Karen knows you're closing in on her. She's trying to shift the narrative and make you the aggressor. I wanted to storm into her next HOA meeting and call her out in front of everyone. But David warned me against any rash moves. We need to stay ahead of her," he said. "Let her make mistakes. She will." And so, I prepared for battle. I spent hours reviewing every piece of evidence we had, from Mark's security footage to the landscaper's records. I cataloged every letter, every email, every pointed comment Karen had made about the tree. My lawyer even managed to subpoena HOA meeting minutes that revealed her obsession with removing its stretched back years. But Karen wasn't going down quietly. She doubled down on her narrative, rallying the HOA board to her side. Flyers began appearing in mailboxes, warning residents about the dangers of neglected trees and praising the HOA's swift action in mitigating risks to the community. My neighbors, once vocal in their support of the oak, grew quieter. Some avoided eye contact altogether. At the same time, Karen turned up the pressure on my property. The HOA began issuing fines for minor infractions, leaves on the lawn, a recycling bin left out for an hour too long, even a claim that my porch light was too bright and disrupted the uniform nighttime ambience of the neighborhood. It was harassment, plain and simple. But Karen was smart. Each move she made was just subtle enough to toe the line of legality, and it was clear she was banking on me folding under the weight of it all. But instead of breaking, I became more resolute. I was no longer just fighting for the tree or for my backyard. I was fighting for my dignity, for the principle that bullies like Karen couldn't simply rewrite reality to suit their whims. The lawsuit meant we'd be heading to court, and while the prospect was daunting, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction. For the first time, Karen wouldn't have her clipboard or her HOA cronies to hide behind. She'd have to face the truth, and this time, it would be on my terms. What I didn't yet realize was just how deep Karen's schemes went, and how explosive the courtroom showdown would become. Walking into David's office for our pre-trial meeting, I felt the weight of the entire ordeal pressing on my shoulders. The legal world was foreign to me, a labyrinth of jargon and procedure that Karen seemed to navigate with gleeful malice. But David was calm as ever, his office a sanctuary of order amid the chaos. "She's built her case on a house of cards," David said, sliding a thick folder across the desk. Inside were the key pieces of evidence we'd compiled, neatly organized into sections. "But it's a loud house of cards. Karen's hoping the noise distracts from how weak her foundation is." David's plan was simple. Attack the narrative she'd constructed. We wouldn't just defend my actions. We'd dismantle her credibility piece by piece, exposing her vendetta for what it was. The first line of attack was the fire itself. David had lined up the firefighters who'd been on the scene to testify about the accelerant, the unnatural spread of the flames, and the improbability of the fire being caused by neglect. The arson report was damning, and while it didn't name Karen directly, it painted a picture of deliberate sabotage. Then there was Mark's security footage. Though grainy, it placed Karen at the scene minutes before the fire began. Combined with the landscaper's records, specifically her request for a flammability assessment, it created a strong circumstantial case that the fire wasn't an accident. Our ace in the hole, however, was the HOA meeting minutes. David had found a pattern in the records. Karen's obsession with the tree wasn't about safety or property values but control. Her comments often bordered on personal, referring to me as uncooperative and a thorn in the HOA's side. One line in particular stood out: "We need to set an example. Homeowners need to understand that non-compliance isn't an option." "Her ego is her biggest weakness," David said, tapping the page with a pen. "She's turned this into a personal crusade, and it's all over the documentation. A judge will see it for what it is: abuse of power." Karen, of course, wasn't idle. Her lawyer had built a narrative that painted me as an irresponsible homeowner whose neglect endangered the neighborhood. She leaned heavily on her HOA allies, trotting out board members to back her claims. They parroted her talking points with rehearsed precision, describing the tree as an accident waiting to happen, and insisting that my resistance had forced the HOA to act. But cracks were already forming in her coalition. Some neighbors, wary of being dragged into the drama, began to speak out. Sarah and Mark were vocal in their support, and a few others came forward with stories about Karen's bullying tactics. One elderly neighbor even recounted how Karen had threatened to fine her over a non-compliant mailbox until she agreed to install one of Karen's recommended models at twice the price of a standard box. As the court date approached, I felt a strange mix of dread and determination. Karen had thrown everything she had at me, but for the first time, I felt like I wasn't just reacting. I was fighting back, and I had the truth on my side. The morning of the hearing, I stood outside the courthouse, clutching my folder of evidence like a shield. Karen arrived a few minutes later, flanked by her lawyer and a small entourage of HOA loyalists. She looked confident, smug even, as though victory were inevitable. But as the gavel fell and the proceedings began, I could see the faintest flicker of doubt in her eyes. She wasn't in her HOA domain anymore. Here, the rules were different. Here, her power plays and petty tactics wouldn't go unchallenged. I took a deep breath as David stood to make his opening argument. This was it, the moment Karen's carefully constructed facade would begin to crumble. And I was ready to see it all come crashing down. The courtroom was a battleground, but one where the weapons weren't swords or shields. They were facts and logic. Karen sat across the aisle, her face composed but her fingers tapping nervously on the polished oak table. Her lawyer opened with a fiery statement, painting me as a negligent homeowner whose stubbornness had put the community at risk. He leaned into Karen's favorite narrative. The tree was overgrown, dangerous, and ultimately my fault. He described the fire as the inevitable outcome of my refusal to comply with the HOA's requests, calling it a disaster waiting to happen. Karen nodded along, her expression carefully measured, as if she were already savoring her victory. Then it was David's turn. He rose from his seat with a calm confidence that immediately shifted the energy in the room. He began not with an attack, but with a story about the oak tree. He described its age, its history, and its significance to the community, drawing the judge into a narrative that was less about rules and regulations and more about legacy and preservation. Karen Thompson, David said, gesturing toward her, has spent months trying to frame this tree, and my client, as a danger. But the evidence will show that the real danger to this community wasn't the tree. It was her. The first witnesses called were the firefighters who had responded the night of the blaze. One by one, they detailed how the fire had been deliberately set, confirming the presence of an accelerant and the unnaturally fast spread of the flames. David showed photos of the charred base of the tree, pointing out the clear burn patterns. Karen's lawyer objected, claiming it was irrelevant since the fire wasn't directly tied to Karen. But David was ready. "Your Honor," he said, "we're establishing a pattern of behavior. This fire wasn't an accident. It was the culmination of a deliberate campaign to remove this tree by any means necessary." Next came Mark. He was nervous but resolute as he described the grainy security footage and identified the figure walking toward my backyard as Karen. The video played on a monitor, the courtroom silent as the flickering flames illuminated her retreating figure. Karen's lawyer tried to dismiss it as inconclusive, but the landscaper's records told a different story. David presented emails between Karen and the company, highlighting her repeated inquiries about the tree's flammability and her frustration when they refused to remove it. And then came the HOA meeting minutes. David had them printed in bold, annotated for clarity, and he read aloud Karen's most damning statements. The courtroom was hushed as he emphasized her intent to set an example and her insistence that the tree's removal was non-negotiable. Finally, it was my turn to testify. I described the years I'd spent caring for the oak, the letters Karen had sent, and the relentless pressure she'd applied. I spoke about the ash I'd found, the flicker of light I'd seen the night of the fire, and the harassment that had followed. I kept my voice steady, but I made sure my anger was clear. When Karen took the stand, her composure faltered for the first time. David's cross-examination was merciless. He asked her to explain her presence near my property the night of the fire. She stammered, claiming she'd been on a routine inspection. "An inspection," David repeated, "at 2 a.m? Karen's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The judge's gaze narrowed as Karen tried to regain her footing. Then David produced the landscaper's emails, the security footage, and the meeting minutes, laying them out in a devastating sequence. By the time he was finished, Karen's story was in tatters. The turning point came when Sarah testified. Calm and articulate, she recounted Karen's repeated threats and her obsession with controlling the neighborhood. "This wasn't about safety," Sarah said, her voice steady. "This was personal. Karen didn't like that someone stood up to her, and she made it her mission to make them pay." As the proceedings drew to a close, Karen sat rigid, her confident veneer completely shattered. The judge adjourned for the day, but the writing was on the wall. The truth was out, and Karen's carefully constructed narrative was crumbling under the weight of her own lies. The final decision was only a day away, but I already knew justice was finally within reach. The courtroom was electric as we reconvened the following day, anticipation thick in the air. Karen sat at her table, her usual air of authority gone. Her shoulders were stiff, her face pale, and her once confident gaze fixed on the papers in front of her. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The judge began by summarizing the case, laying out the arguments from both sides. He commended both legal teams for their thorough presentations, but didn't linger long on pleasantries. "This case," he said, "is about more than a tree or even the fire. It's about accountability and the abuse of power." He started with the fire, citing the firefighter's testimony, the arson report, and the evidence of accelerants. While no one had caught Karen in the act, the circumstantial evidence painted a damning picture. The court finds that there was a deliberate effort to remove the tree by unlawful means, he said, his gaze settling briefly on Karen. Next came the HOA's lawsuit against me. The judge was blunt. The plaintiff's argument that the defendant's negligence caused the fire is unsupported by evidence. On the contrary, the documentation presented by the defense shows a consistent effort to preserve the property, despite repeated interference from the HOA. He dismissed the suit in its entirety. Then, the moment I'd been waiting for. The judge turned his attention to Karen herself. He addressed the pattern of harassment, the misuse of HOA resources, and her personal vendetta against me. This court finds that Ms. Thompson's actions were not only inappropriate but malicious. Her behavior constitutes a gross abuse of her role as president of the HOA. My lawyer had filed a countersuit for damages, and the judge wasn't done. He ordered Karen to pay restitution for the loss of the tree, the legal fees I'd incurred, and the emotional distress her actions had caused. When he announced the total, a sum that would hit Karen hard, she visibly flinched. But the real blow came when the judge recommended that Karen be removed from her position as HOA president. He advised the HOA board to hold an immediate vote to review her leadership, noting that her behavior had brought disrepute to the entire association. The courtroom buzzed as the judge adjourned, his gavel striking like the final nail in Karen's coffin. Outside, I was met with hugs and handshakes from neighbors who had supported me quietly but hadn't dared to speak out until now. Sarah and Mark stood by my side, their smiles wide with relief. "It's over," Sarah said, her voice soft but triumphant. But for Karen, it wasn't over. The HOA board held an emergency meeting that evening, and the result was swift and decisive. Karen was voted out, her reign of control brought to an unceremonious end. Rumors swirled that she was facing additional legal trouble related to the misuse of HOA funds, and by the end of the week, her house was up for sale. The neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The Karen era was over. Though I felt a sense of vindication, there was no celebration. The oak was gone, and no amount of justice could bring it back. Still, as I stood in my backyard that night, staring at the empty space where it once stood, I felt something I hadn't in months. Peace. Karen had underestimated me. She thought her power, her connections, and her relentless determination would be enough to win. But the truth had won out, as it always should. She was gone, and I was still standing. What she didn't understand, what bullies like her never do, is that when you plant your roots deep enough, no fire can destroy what truly matters. The weeks following the trial felt like stepping into a new life. The shadows Karen had cast over my home and my spirit slowly lifted, leaving room for a fragile but welcome sense of normalcy. The neighborhood, once tense and divided, seemed lighter, as though the air had been cleared along with Karen's departure. Despite the victory, the loss of the oak still weighed heavily on me. Every time I glanced at the charred stump, I was reminded not just of Karen's vendetta, but of the countless memories that tree had witnessed and sheltered. Its absence was like a missing piece of the landscape, a quiet ache in my backyard. But life, like nature, has a way of regenerating. One crisp Saturday morning, I woke with a determination I hadn't felt in months. I grabbed a shovel and headed to the stump. It was time to reclaim my backyard. The work was grueling, the roots of the oak so deeply entwined with the earth that removing them felt like uprooting history itself. Yet with each swing of the shovel, each clump of dirt displaced, I felt the heaviness in my chest begin to ease. Neighbors started to take notice, and soon Sarah and Mark were by my side, offering their hands and tools. Before long, a small group of us had gathered, working together to clear the space. By sunset, the yard was transformed. Where the stump had stood was now a patch of rich, dark soil, ready for something new. We gathered on the porch, dirty and exhausted, but there was a sense of camaraderie that hadn't existed in the neighborhood for a long time. A week later, a delivery truck arrived with something I'd ordered quietly, without telling anyone, a sapling. Not just any sapling, a white oak, chosen to honor the one I'd lost. As I planted it in the cleared space, I couldn't help but imagine the years ahead, the tiny tree growing strong and tall, reclaiming its place in the yard. The neighbors embraced the gesture. A few even suggested creating a small plaque to commemorate the original oak and its significance to the community. We held a simple ceremony, gathering around the sapling as Sarah read a poem about resilience and renewal. Though the HOA had been a source of so much strife, its board, now under new, more reasonable leadership, seemed eager to make amends. They revised the community guidelines, ensuring that historical or significant trees would be better protected in the future. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. As the months turned to years, the sapling began to take root, its leaves unfurling in the spring sunlight. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded of the power of perseverance. Karen had tried to break me, to erase a piece of history and impose her will, but she'd failed. The oak had fallen, but its spirit lived on in the soil, in the community, and in the new tree rising to take its place. In the end, the fight wasn't just about a tree. It was about standing up to the kind of small-minded tyranny that thrives in silence. It was about refusing to be bullied, about holding on to what matters even when it feels like the world is against you. As I sat on my porch one quiet evening, the sapling's leaves rustling gently in the breeze, I realized that justice wasn't just about courtrooms or victories. It was about moving forward, rebuilding, and letting the roots of something new grow stronger than the fire that tried to destroy them. The oak was gone, but its legacy was just beginning.